Thank you so much. So, let's just pick up where His Excellency just ended there for us, talking about tangible solution, moving past rhetoric. Minister, maybe let's start in Nigeria, because Nigeria is an example of a country that is beset with so many issues. It would make sense that education gets pushed down in terms of priorities for the fiscal budget. How are you able to campaign to ensure that education gets the right amount of funding from the government?
Well, thank you very much. At the moment, we have a president in Nigeria who is business-oriented and who directs the affairs of the country as if we only have today. That is to say, he's in a hurry to get things done. And he also appreciates the prominence of education. So he's come in with a set of priorities. The government has come in with a set of priorities. And education is one of the top priorities with health and social investment. So the first budget we did, saw a very significant increase in the funding available for education. And he is also, along with his ministers, engaging bilateral partners, regional partners, and the international community to ensure that education, the systems for payment, generally speaking, of taxes, issues about debt, are addressed. And the whole logic for that is to ensure that there is enough money within the system. The budget of the country is big enough to accommodate these priorities we are talking about. And he has created a special fund, for instance, to address major gaps in the infrastructure financing of the country's key infrastructures, which actually includes education. And then students, to address issues of poverty, access to education, because there are quite a large number of people who don't have access to education, who are struggling to have access to education. A special scholarship has been introduced, put in place. And we can't believe that even the legal framework for that was put in place within just 1 week, cutting across the two arms of the National Assembly, so that students have access to loans and bursaries. And there's also a recognition of education, of the type of education. It's not just going to the universities, polytechnics, and all that, but skills, has been brought onto the table as a very major instrument through which education should be given a priority. And for that purpose, students and parents with poor families can have access to that loan to go into skills training, that will not make them to connect with the economy, give them some empowerment and substantive livelihood. And because there's a lot of question about the nature of education, which universities really turned out, the qualifications which are turned out, that they are really not quite relevant to the needs of the society at the moment and the needs of the economy. So there's a lot of emphasis in skilling the education system, right from the foundation level of education, so that graduates either from primary school or from secondary school, right through the university, can finish their school with some form of skills that will now ensure that they don't have to depend on salaries or go for salary employments. They can stand on their own. So with these measures, there's a lot of attention on education, finance, and of course it has been established already that despite the need for external funding, which actually contributes to just about 3 to 5% of the funds needed for education. Most of the money for education must still have to come from within national resources.
Right.
And that's why all the issues surrounding tax, with the way they have to pay the appropriate tax, which a lot of them are getting away with at the moment, and a lot of this with their multinational institutions. And some of the laws which enable them, cannot be addressed just within the national borders. It has to be addressed at international fora.
Absolutely.
And so this is where some of the partnerships with regional and global institutions have to be stronger.
Yeah.
And then
I'd love to bring in Minister Sackey, though, to also get his perspective from Sierra Leone, because Sierra Leone, of course, much of the investment externally, we were just talking to the minister about that, goes towards the mining sector. And so are you relying more on domestic funding in order to support education, or is it external donors that are helping the sector right now?
Well, first of all, let me thank the EAA for inviting me to yet another series of discussion around this very pertinent issue. And thank you, Madam Moderator, for your question. Like my colleague from Nigeria, our president is very much signed into education. As a matter of fact, education was the flagship of the government in the first term of His Excellency. And to make sure that he demonstrated that in a very meaningful way, we are allocating 22% of our budget to education. So I know my colleague from Turkey, I think, mentioned 15%. Even though I know when we look at the absolute numbers, the zeros at the back of Turkey will be completely different from ours. But from a very poor country's perspective, we are allocating 22%. Incidentally, we are now in the second term of His Excellency and the final term in office. We have also, in the last budget, have ring-fenced 1% of all withholding taxes to go into education. So that's a variable tax in a sense on how much we can raise revenues. So even from the government coffers, there is a significant amount of monies that we put forward on the table. I think that is a very good recipe when you approach donors, because in a sense you're actually saying, we believe in what we are saying, we believe that this is what's going to be transformative to change our society, and we are willing to invest in it. So if we come to you and ask you to collaborate with us, you know that we mean what we are saying. So yes, this is how we have funded education over the last 6 years.
But the opportunity and the option to tax and also allocate more of the fiscal budget isn't always an option. Leonardo, I want you to jump in here. And this is where the innovative financing component comes in. Can you talk about how your firm is helping countries like these and others who don't have the option to add on taxes and others for education?
Yes, exactly. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to the Foundation and the government of Qatar. So indeed, I'm part of the Sovereign Advisory Team at Lazard. We help governments and public sector institutions to exactly cope with those kind of challenges. And I think two landmark transactions we were very proud to advise last year were with the government of Gabon and with the government of Ecuador. So I would like to talk in a minute about those, because I think that could be a blueprint to increase spending in the education sector for countries that could replicate those transactions. So the idea is debt swaps. So those instruments are basically a way to adjust the debt profile of a country under different forms in exchange for more spending into a given sector. So that can be to address climate change, to focus on nature, to focus on health, but also education could be a very good candidate to do that. So what we did in Ecuador and in Gabon was a market transaction. You also have debt swap on bilateral claims, so you just have one country negotiating with another to reduce the debt service in exchange for some commitments related to the SDGs. But for those two countries, these were market transactions. So the idea was to buy back some part of the traded debt at a discount This was supported by the US government, by some multilateral development banks, the IDB stepped in Ecuador. And so you buy back the debt in exchange for some commitments, in this case, that particular case, in the field of nature, marine preservation. So you issue a new debt with more affordable terms, you buy back your old debt, you generate some savings, and you invest part of those savings toward a given sector. So in a nutshell, this is what we achieved. Just to give you some numbers, because I think, especially for Ecuador, this was quite impressive. We issued a new debt of 650 million, and we were able to buy back 1.6 billion of outstanding debt. So it means that the government, doing that transaction, actually reduced its external debt by 1 billion. So this is really massive. And we were able to negotiate a program to invest into marine preservation of 300 million. So this is really substantial.
Is your firm focused then on expanding it to education? Because it is really focused right now on climate. I mean, what is the opportunity then for education to become a part of this?
Exactly. So you will have to find countries where the debt is trading at a discount because you have to secure some form of debt reduction. And then you will have to find a multilateral development bank, DFI, keen to guarantee the new debt. And in exchange for some commitments in the education sector. And we've been working at Lazard on some of those transactions. So education is a very good candidate for the obvious reasons that were mentioned. We've been working a lot on the healthcare as well. And so you have to find a guarantor for the new debt, a government where the debt conditions, create some good conditions to do that. And of course, you need to engage with a very credible development partner. So this is where potentially the education above all could play a role. You could work with the World Bank, with other development-focused institutions, with the Islamic Development Bank, obviously. So there are many options on the table to structure something that could address and target the education sector.
The Honourable Minister from Nigeria, would you consider a solution of this kind, especially considering Nigeria's debt situation? I mean, would it potentially help expedite some of the gaps that you're seeing in financing for the sector?
Oh, certainly. The issue of debt is a very major burden on us because we'll have a situation where already inching towards the situation where debt repayment is already overcoming what is available actually for investment in the social sector we are talking about, education and health. So debt relief definitely will go a long way, debt freeze will go a long way, but that has to be targeted, properly targeted, because a lot of times if the relief is in a very general way and then the money comes in, it's now go into that particular sector of need, then at the end of the day, we are not getting the benefit out of it. And furthermore, it also impacts on available resources, even domestically, because when you use much of the money to service those days, and then it becomes a problem. And then, again, what type of education you are going into, because that's also another issue. For us, we feel there should be more concentration on the foundational aspect of education, primary schools, secondary schools, and then where you are making this kind of policy and arrangements, that has to be a part of what will go into the equation. Because if it's just a general relief for the sake of it, and then that leaves governments to deploy the money as they wish into some other sectors. And so it's a very innovative way of addressing resources for that level of education. People who are out of school, they can come with all these conditions so that when those resources come, they are targeted. And then the issue of management of the resources too. We've seen so much of the resources deployed. Other much of it is gone on administrative, non-substantive things that actually touch the main issues of education, teachers training, and then retraining, conditions of service. So these are some of the details which should go into any negotiations in debt, innovative solutions in handling release in the areas of debt, and even external intervention, generally speaking, which could also include, as I said earlier on, reviewing the taxes, in the country.
Can you take us into the conversations, not in full detail, but that you are potentially having with some of these other ministries just about this prioritization of education? Because as you mentioned, it really becomes challenging when the money comes in and it's not allocated correctly. I mean, how are you able then to convince them that this is a priority?
Yes, on the one part, we all recognize that the centrality of education, it is actually goes to the heart of the development of any country. But a lot of times too, there's a bit of tension between other services and education. They think you are just asking for too much in a way, because the benefits in education are not clearly now and visible.
It's a long-term.
It's a long-term investment, but we all know that investment in education is actually investment about really the future of the whole country and humanity. So it's a very tough, conversation going on. Particularly those who are in finance, who see education because it's a consumption kind of investment. You don't really make money out of it. But in the case of Nigeria, it has a lot of diversity anyway, because the private sector in education is very strong, thriving at all the sectors. But much of the problem we are talking about are people who are struggling to have access to education with, at the moment, right now in Nigeria, we are talking about, although the figures differ here and there, but we are talking about close to about 20 million, young men and girls who have access, who are struggling to have access to education, with a great number of them being girls, and then we have people struggle from lower level families, poor families who are having problem with access to education. So the public education component of it, they need to benefit from this kind of available resources from either from national budgets or bilateral, multilateral institutions like this. Mm-hmm. So we need to put in a lot of money there, but we also need to have a very good system in place that assures transparency and accountability, so that every dollar, every naira in our own cadres goes there can be accounted for. As I said, we want to see that money, the impact of the money on ground. Mm-hmm. That has always been my own message. It's not if you are bringing 50 million, I want to see outcome, practical outcome for that 50 million. So these are the kind of things I would like to be working with, contributions from outside, to see that we get really value for money.
Minister Sackey, maybe you can talk about those metrics that the minister was just speaking about, especially because as he was speaking about prioritizing women and youth, I know is something that you have focused in on. What are the metrics that you assess to ensure that there is progress and there's actually tangible outcomes that are coming from this investment?
Well, I think taking into consideration that we spend a significant amount of our resources on education, I think we have a moral obligation in education to be able to justify that spend. So we have been very innovative and creative in the way we do this. So let me just share with you one experience. We have a project called the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge, where we're funding 5 different providers to be innovative in the way they teach foundational literacy, and we pay them on the basis of results. So if you cannot produce the results, then you're not being paid. Also, we are moving away from, in terms of the way we fund education, we are moving away on funding inputs. So, in the past, when you receive funding, you have a number of activities, and then you pay people for delivering those activities. What we are now saying, the focus of our education sector plan is focused on improving learning outcomes. And so we will only pay you on outcomes. And there is a relationship between input and output. But for that to happen, you also have to have a credible data to be able to see the connections. And also you have to have robust monitoring and evaluation as well. So you mentioned the issue of our focus on girl-child education. So currently we have a parity of gender parity in our educational system up until junior secondary level. So some of the initiatives that we've put in place, and we have a policy of radical inclusion, we have actually started to see tangible results as a result of that. That has been smart in terms of how we deploy our limited resources and expecting outcomes from those resources.
Leonardo, I saw the minister looking at you when he was saying it's difficult to convince those in finance. I mean, is the market ready to buy into this, to invest into this? Do they acknowledge the importance of investing into these smaller economies, especially?
Yes, this is a very important point. And first, let me say that when we talk about debt swap, because there's been a lot of confusion around the term, what it means, we are not talking about debt restructuring, which is not a market-friendly transaction, because obviously you negotiate new terms and you have to engage into negotiations and debt restructuring. We are more talking about, and this was the case for Ecuador and Gabon and other market-friendly, I would say, debt swap. This is just a debt exchange. You do not impose terms on your creditors, on your bondholders. So this is not a debt restructuring as such. This is really you launch an offer and then the market and the investors, the bondholders, if they want to participate, they participate. If they don't want, they can just not be part of the deal. And we have been seeing a lot of interest in participating in those transactions, not only from the bondholder community, but also from the insurance space, because, for instance, USDFC, that has been a very strong advocate and supporter for those debt swap, is also active on the insurance market. Other players are there. And so in the insurance market, those transactions have attracted a lot of attention and a lot of interest, because I think everyone realized that when you participate into those kind of swaps, you are at the same time achieving something from a financial perspective, but also you are supporting development outcomes. And I think this has been quite successful so far. Obviously, those transactions take a long time to structure, to negotiate, and for a very good reason, which is the development part of. This is not just a financial transaction. There is a development component attached to it, and you need to be very credible. And this is why having the support of the international community, multilateral development banks, credible institutions such as the Education Above All, for instance, if you think about the education sector, other credible partners. We worked with the Nature Conservancy in the US on the field of nature. So you need to have very credible partners on the ground to structure that development part of the transaction, and it takes time. And this is a condition also for the participation of the financial sector into those operations.
Is there a potential partnership here that we can preview?
Well, let me say, I mean, many banks are looking at those transactions. I think the key message I would like to share is really about credibility. Like I said, I mean, you cannot think of and attracting significant support from the international community if the development project is not credible. And it takes time. And this is what we have been doing. At Lazard, we are financial advisor. We are not trading securities. We are an investment bank, but independent. We do not have a balance sheet. So it takes time. You need to be committed to it. I think, to really structure, from the outset, such a transaction can take more than 1 year. So it's not like, selling some bonds.
Right.
It takes time.